This episode is brought to you by WeatherGuard Lightning Tech. At WeatherGuard, we make wind turbine lightning protection easy. If you're a wind farm operator, stop settling for damaged turbine blades and constant downtime. Get your uptime back with our Strike Tape lightning protection system. Learn more in today's show notes or visit weatherguardwind.com/striketape.
Welcome back. I'm Alan Hall.
I'm Dan Blewett, and this is the Uptime Podcast, where we talk about wind energy, engineering, lightning protection, and ways to keep your wind turbines running. Hey, welcome back to the Uptime Podcast. I'm your co-host, Dan Blewett. No Alan Hall today. He'll be back in a couple of weeks, but the show will continue to go on as scheduled. So this week, I'm going to catch you up on some 2021 trends and tech to kind of follow up on and maybe forecast a little bit. So there's a lot of interesting things that have developed even just in the last year of this podcast, and we are closing in. This is our 47th episode. So we're actually getting pretty close to our year anniversary. So number one, we thank you for listening to the Uptime Podcast. It's grown significantly over the years. We've gotten some great feedback, made some great connections, and hopefully made your day, your commute, what your work from home, whatever it is, a little bit better. So today we're going to talk about some trends and tech, 6 different ones. So number one, we'll talk about the size of turbines and why you should consider following that in 2021. Crawling robots versus wire cable robots versus drones. That seems to be a battle that's being waged to see which of those technologies will be maybe not most viable. I think that's the wrong way of putting it, but which ones are going to become the forefront and the premium solutions for a lot of these inspections, cleanings, and maintenance operations, because the technology continues to evolve. And as it continues to gain traction and win more service jobs, these technologies are going to start to, one's going to pull ahead of the other. And of course, not every solution is going to be right for every type of maintenance or inspection. But anyway, we'll chat a little bit more about that. Different areas for non-traditional massive wind farms. So 2 examples that we'll chat about are distributed wind and traffic powered. That's another interesting one. Who knows if that will really catch on, but it's something to keep in mind. Ecosystem type offshore wind projects. This is something we've talked about a number of times over the past year, where people are starting to do other things in their offshore projects. Perhaps do ocean research, perhaps cultivate like an aquaculture lab, whether it's shellfish or something else. And it seems like that trend, more and more people seem to be thinking about that, and it doesn't seem like that's going to go away as these ideas crop up of ways to make these offshore platforms. And essentially these big rigs are ecosystems, to some degree. And can we make them ecosystems and make them as multifunctional as possible rather than just generating electricity? We've already put all the work to install it. What else can we do out there? I think that trend's going to continue. 3D printing, we'll chat about that. And then 2 more, EVTOLs, and their potential use in offshore wind sites. So if you listen to our other podcast on aerospace engineering called Struck, we talk a bunch about EVTOLs, which is electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And obviously a helicopter is a VTOL. It's not electric. But a lot of these EVTOLs are essentially electric helicopters or similar aircraft. And, their applications, if some of these offshore wind farms become ecosystems, or they have platforms where we're going to need to transport crews out there consistently, EVTOLs are probably going to make a lot of sense to service some of those offshore wind farms. And lastly, we'll talk about misinformation, birds, human health, noise property values, some of these common issues, and what to look for going forward. All right, first up on the docket here. So there's some news from Vestas. So Vestas has just now released their new flagship competitor for, biggest wind turbine in the world. And so the V236 15MW prototype was just announced on the 10th of February. And this is going to have a 236 meter rotor diameter. And that's, 14 meters longer than the Siemens Gamesa 222DD, which has a 222 meter diameter rotor. So obviously, this was probably not it's probably not a shocker, considering Vestas is the largest supplier of wind turbines, and they did not have a fighter in the ring, right? For largest, there was the GE Halley 8X, there's again the Siemens Gamesa 222DD, and now Vestas has their competitor in the ring with the V236 15MW. So that's just been announced. They're hoping to have their first prototype installed in the summer of 2022, is reporting by Wind Power Monthly, and hopefully they will be up and running in 2024. And so, this is an interesting development where we've talked about this prior. How big can these get? How big can the capacity get? And is this going to be maybe a plateau for a little while? So now that all the major competitors have this big turbine, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out and, what we start to see as these get installed, because with bigger scale, there's going to be problems. Vestas had some issues with lightning throughout the country this year. And as these big prototypes get rolled out, scale is a factor. Now, with Vestas finally getting in the ring, it's just going to be interesting to see, are there any significant bumps in offshore wind size after this one, right? It seems like, there's been a number of orders for Halley 8Xs. There's been a number of orders for 222DDs from Siemens Gamesa. So is this going to be sort of that leveling off period where these need to be out into the wild and performing before we start to see 16, 17, 18, 20 megawatt? My guess is probably, but yet to be seen. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2021 if anything new's rolled out. Obviously, there's always upgrades to onshore and all sorts of different, different platforms. But this is a pretty interesting development with Vestas now having the largest rotor diameter in the world. All right, next up, and this is a really interesting trend. So we're hopefully going to chat with a head of one of the robotics companies coming up here soon in the next couple of months. And we've talked with Danis Cruz, who's a co-founder of Arones. We've also talked with CEO Danny Ellis of SkySpecs. So we've gotten some good input from some of the leaders in robotics in the wind sector. And so right now it seems like there's, again, this sort of duel happening, right? Drones clearly have tons of utility for operations and maintenance, for inspections, and robotics. So Arones, their robotic tech is a guided wire system, and they can do a lot with that without having some of the potential limiting factors of, a very complex robot that needs to have, suction to maintain traction on a blade and not fall off. And then of course there's Blade Bug, and they're doing exactly that. Their crawling robot, uses suction, other technology to stay stuck to the blade and physically walk up and down the turbine blade surface. So it'll be interesting to see how all this fleshes out as these get more and more, service contracts, and they hone their product. And just like anything else, once it gets out there into the market and they're working with it, they're going to see what works, what doesn't, how they can evolve. Technologies continue to evolve very rapidly. Battery technology is a limiting factor for drones. Suction technologies can be a limiting factor for any walking robot, stuff like that. And as these, again, like technology is accelerating so fast, so as those challenges get tackled, use cases are going to change rapidly, and it'll be really interesting to see how this fleshes out in the next year or two. Obviously they're all going to have their niche. So there's going to be things that drones can do that a robot could never do. And there's going to be things that robots can do much faster and more easily than a drone could do. So it's not to say that anything's going to replace one or the other. They're all going to have their niche probably. And, but it'll be interesting to see how these technologies continue to evolve over the next couple years. Next up, so if you haven't seen this, we'll post a link in the description of the show here in podcast land and on YouTube. But traffic-powered wind is a really interesting. So this is basically a vertical axis wind turbine, and as cars zoom down the highway, the wind produced, by a car, by a bus, whatever, it's going to push these wind turbines that are anchored onto or installed on the median. So this is also kind of in the same vein as distributed wind, obviously being smaller wind turbines, still of the traditional, horizontal, or could be vertical axis. But distributed wind is obviously the smaller wind turbines where they can be placed in much more residential areas, places where traditional wind farm could not go. And so these two sectors or segments of the market, potentially traffic powered and distributed wind, they're going to start to probably get some traction. And I don't know about the technology of traffic. That's still a really early budding technology. But as we go looking to, create more and more energy from renewable sources and to find little gaps and, that are not filled by the huge commercial wind farm and, the vast amount of capital that takes, the traffic stuff is really interesting. Who knows if it will take hold? Who knows if it'll make sense, if it'll be viable? Because there's more than just installing, this vertical axis wind turbine in the middle of a highway. There's accidents. What happens in car wrecks? If a tire blows and a piece of tire shrapnel hits one, is that taking it offline? Where are the cables going to be run? There's lots of other factors involved. Distributed wind, the same thing. There's lots of unknowns as this market hopefully starts to grow in the U.S. And we'll be talking to someone about distributed wind shortly here on the show. But these two markets they're untapped for the most part especially here in the U.S. So it'll be interesting to see how those two start to take shape, because there's definitely lots of land that's got the wind, and there's going to be small businesses, farms, a lot of them in the Midwest that could potentially benefit from wind power. And as the Biden administration moves forward with new policies, it might become favorable for the environment of all sorts of devices like that. Not only distributed traditional wind turbines, but also sort of outside the box stuff like the traffic powered. So it'll be interesting to see how the little guys start to fare, because commercial large scale wind projects have proven their effectiveness. They've proven that they can drive electricity costs down, but the little stuff hasn't yet. But there seems like there's definitely a market for it, and as the technology and the grid and infrastructure improves, it'll be really interesting to see how that takes off. So next is the ecosystem type offshore wind project, and we've reported on a couple of these in previous shows, where they're just saying, hey, we've got an installation of wind turbines out here. Maybe we can build a couple of platforms. Maybe we can build, other, whether it's housing, whether it's labs, whether it's underwater, aquaculture, infrastructure, where we can say, hey, we can do some research out here. We can have, maybe humans out here for a couple weeks at a time. We can do different things using these offshore wind turbines, which are already sort of anchored in place and providing a base where it's not going to be a significant additional cost to add on, a base for a helipad and an aquaculture lab and some rudimentary housing to keep researchers out there for a week or two, stuff like that. I think these are interesting ideas, the viability of which is certainly yet to be proven. But again, we've had oil rigs and, oil rig workers working on these platforms for months on end for, decades now, right? So it's clear that we can keep workers, we can keep, human beings comfortable enough. And who knows about the living conditions. I know it's an incredibly dangerous job working on an oil rig, but the housing and feeding these people and maintaining the work environment on an oil rig, it's been something that's been viable, right, for a number of decades. So taking that idea and saying, all right, we have all these offshore wind projects. Is there a way where we can do ocean research? Is that we can do aquaculture? We can do other things. It's an interesting idea, and I think that's one to kind of keep tabs on, and we'll keep tabs on that here on the show. But I think it's going to make sense at some point, because you're already sinking, $100 million into an offshore wind project. What's another $1 million to have a really nice, accessible lab or something else that perhaps helps to study, the impact of wind farms on the environment, whatever it might be. And obviously there's lots of other startups. There could be companies that work on, desalination could be an example. I'm just spitballing, but there's lots of other things that could potentially start to partner and grab the coattails of these wind projects. And I think it's a really interesting idea, because as you start to have all this capital behind these projects, and as they become pretty consistent, and we know about the technology, they know how to build them effectively, quickly, cheaply, relatively cheaply. As those costs come down, say, hey, what else can we do with this? Like, how can we think outside the box? I think that's a really interesting thing, and I'm hopeful to see more companies try to innovate in that space. And along those same lines, like I said, in our other podcasts, we talk about eVTOLs. And so electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, as battery technology improves and, as composite technology has improved, we're finally getting close to the point where there's many companies. There's Joby Aviation is probably the forefront. There's Archer, there's Kitty Hawk. There's a number of startups who are actively in this race to get a commercially viable electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle out into the market. And if you're not familiar with this, it's really fascinating, but they're trying to essentially make urban air mobility a real thing. And, I think in the past, this was, connecting building to building in New York City, or getting someone from, Long Island to the city, in an hour or hour and a half versus 5 hours, right? To reduce some of those urban commutes. That's yet to be seen, but what does seem like could be very commercially viable would be transport to an offshore wind site. So if we did have this part where, hey, we need a couple of technicians out, at an offshore wind farm for a couple of days or a week, and we have built, housing for them or whatever it is, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft seem like a pretty good fit for that, where they can just sort of puddle jump from, the Florida Keys over to the wind farm in the Gulf, if there was one, and it'd be a short, environmentally friendly because it's electric powered and battery powered, and that seems like that's going to be part of that ecosystem one day. That's my forecast, because helicopters, obviously, they're the way you do that now, right? That's how you get to an oil rig is via helicopter, and helicopters can be dangerous. They require a lot of energy, and the eVTOL market, there's a lot of engineers that are working to solve that problem, to reduce the cost of these trips back and forth. Helicopters are not cheap. Jet fuel is not cheap. All those things. So this will be interesting to see how those can kind of coexist and how that works. Not to mention the fact that many wind sites are very remote, right? So as you start to look at, you have a wind farm up in the mountains that would take you an hour and a half to travel to by car. Can you jump in your company's eVTOL and fly to the top of the mountain in 20 minutes? That seems like a very viable thing. And so as wind farms become more and more remote, and obviously tons of them are already extremely remote in very harsh environments, some of that vehicle travel could probably be replaced by eVTOL travel. So, of course, obviously these are very windy environments. So there's lots of challenges with aviation, right, in those environments. But the eVTOL market is seemingly going to play some role in the future, with wind farms, because again, they're in harsh environments, they're offshore, they're in the mountains, they're in snowy regions. Lots of times, air travel, especially if it's quick and economical, is probably going to start to make sense. All right, the last technology that I want to talk about that I think is really fascinating, and I'd encourage you, we'll put links here in the show, and we are also going to have someone in the 3D printing space talk to us on the show, hopefully coming up soon, is the 3D printing of, wind turbine concrete bases and potentially other components. And I think they're just starting to scratch the surface of this. We've reported that, ORE Catapult in Scotland, this incubator, they've been installing 3D printing capacity there. And they're trying to see the viability of testing prototypes for new wind turbine blades. Cobod and other companies are already printing concrete bases in buildings. So this could have major implications for construction, speeding some of these builds along, whether it's building the concrete bases themselves, building auxiliary buildings, lots of different stuff, and potentially building these more cost effectively in smaller nations. Like if you're in a small island nation, it might be much more cost effective to quickly build a concrete based tower system or concrete, auxiliary buildings on site, rather than, have to do precast and all the traditional, shipping and all that stuff. So 3D printing is going to continue to evolve. And, as we start to look at wind turbine blades, if there's a lightning strike on the tip, or there's otherwise tip damage, or you need to install a blade extension, could a 3D printed blade tip extension be the answer to that? Could a 3D printed section of blade to replace a damaged section be the answer to that? Those are all interesting questions that I'll be curious to see if those can be solved as some of these incubators and other startup companies continue to explore the limits of 3D printing. And lastly, and I think this is something to really be concerned about, is some of the misinformation about wind energy. So we talked about this with Paul Geip, who was a guest on, I believe it was episode 37. And Paul's a wind energy advocate and really a lifer. And I think he has his eyes wide open about a lot of these issues that have plagued, the advancement of the wind industry in the past. And one of them is misinformation. So it's funny that actually on Facebook, if you follow the WeatherGuard wind energy page, we've been, putting out a lot of content there, and we promoted just a couple of educational articles recently, and it's fascinating getting some of the feedback. So one of the things we promoted a couple of articles that were purely educational in nature about, trailing edge serrations, power curve upgrades, other stuff like that. And what the comments for some of those articles are? They have nothing to do with the article themselves. It's like, well, hey, this article is about trailing edge serrations. Oh, better to, it'll certainly kill birds more effectively. Or, this other, power curve upgrades. Oh, best way to upgrade these, just get rid of the darn things and replace it with, clean coal. It's fascinating, some of the misconceptions that are popping up even on Facebook, where people are just opposed to wind turbines. And we're not even selling, right? Like WeatherGuard Lightning Tech is not selling wind turbines. They're just helping to maintain them with lightning protection. But at the same time, it's comical to see the quotes and the comments about some of these articles that have literally nothing to do with birds. They have literally nothing to do with noise or human health or some of these other issues. But there's a lot of people who are opponents of wind energy. I think everyone knows that. But a lot of these opponents are seemingly propped up with misinformation. We talked about a couple of stories and research studies earlier in the year about bird deaths and how often are birds killed and negatively impacted by wind turbines. Same thing with bats. And more studies are coming out that are confirming that it's not a significant risk and health hazard to birds, especially not when compared to the oil and gas industries. But yet, the oil and gas industries and your local coal plant, they've been there for decades, so you're not really drawing your eye up at them. Whereas this new installation of wind turbines, environmental activists are saying, oh, hey, we need to slow down and make sure this is safe for the birds. Whereas the coal has been polluting the atmosphere for decades and certainly killing all of us more slowly from pollution, right? So it's interesting to see why some people oppose it. And so my bigger point here is not the fact that some of this misinformation does exist. And of course, to play both sides of this, we do still need to track the long-term implications of these machines, right? So noise does pose some sort of effect on humans, right? You can't expect to constantly have a hum or an electromagnetic field that you're suddenly living with for 50 years, and maybe there's some effect that we just don't know of. Maybe we can't measure that in 10 years, but we can measure it in 50 years. Just like we know we've had foods that the FDA has cleared that 10 years later we found, hey, these were actually pretty hazardous. The hydrogenated oils were a great example. That was cleared by everyone. They were in Oreo cookies for many, many years. And then suddenly, hey, we've figured out now, finally, that hydrogenated oils are terrible for you. So it's not to say that there isn't some of this information is probably correct, and there's also an agnostic issue where we don't know yet. Just because wind energy has been around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years doesn't mean we know everything about it. We will certainly find out down the road that certain things that we thought were harmless were actually had some harmful effect. Hopefully it's very minimal, and it's probably very minimal, but we don't know for certain everything right now. Now more and more studies are coming out, and we know that there's accepted noise levels that wind turbines have to meet in these new installations. We try to, when I say we, I'm just saying the wind industry in general is trying to, install measures to be safe for bats, to deter birds from flying into them, et cetera, et cetera. and even to prevent light pollution at night. We're hopefully going to be talking with someone who, deals with the aviation obstruction lights with wind turbines, because those can be a nuisance for people at night, and how they can mitigate that nuisance. So all these issues are issues for some people who live with them. And there's some people who are very outspoken opponents of it, who have maybe one in their neighborhood, or are afraid their property value has dropped because of it. But the bigger point here is the campaign against them sometimes can be fraught with misinformation. And so there's a lot of myth debunking that's done. So if you go to any of the governmental websites, there's a lot of like fact checking and myth busting PDFs. So go on from the climaterealityproject.org that gives some pretty compelling facts about some of these myths about, does it harm wildlife? Does it kill property value? Is it too expensive? Is it actually economically effective and viable? So one of the things, as we saw with the presidential election, no matter which side you're on, we saw that misinformation can spread virally and be an extremely negative force. So it'll be interesting to see as the wind industry evolves, and of course is largely accepted by most people, right? A minority voice can speak very loudly. And I think the vast majority of people have a minimal opinion of wind energy in general. Certainly not an overly strong one. Of course, so again, a lot of the minority voices can be quite loud, but there will continue to be a major need for messaging and for keeping misinformation in check, and just to continue to prop up an industry that's hopefully doing good for the environment and for the cost of energy as energy prices continue to rise. So that'll be another interesting thing that I think is worth tracking, and just something to think about, because all these industries, as they're lobbied for and pushed through with policy, et cetera, real human beings have to check off on those policies and have to sign them off on these regulations. So misinformation can run really deep, and if it gets to the point where a couple of the people who need to sign off on legislation are buying into that misinformation, that can be a real major problem. So something to check up on in 2020. So again, thank you for listening. We will hopefully be back to our normal format soon. We're going to have some great guests coming up. Alan will be back in a couple weeks, and we thank you again for listening to the Uptime podcast. Be sure to subscribe here on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you listen. Leave us a review. Thank you so much, and we'll see you here next week. Is downtime causing you financial pain and putting a stop to your power production for months on end? It's no secret, lightning strike damage is a major cause of wind turbine downtime. This damage is preventable with our easy-to-install strike tape lightning protection system for wind turbine blades. Our incredible engineering, build quality, materials, and edge sealants withstand up to 5 times more abuse in the toughest weather and lightning conditions. And we've got the research to prove it. If you're tired of constant downtime, we can help. Reach out to us at weatherguardwind.com and schedule a free call. We'll get your uptime back in no time.